Hello, this is chapter 4 of the macroeconomic book, and this has some pretty crazy statistics in it, talking about poverty, capitalism, and growth. And so if you think, so I'm just going to go over some of these stats, which probably shocked me when I saw them, probably pretty shocking to you as well. So 50 years ago, half the world was in poverty. Today, 15% of the world population is estimated to be in poverty. Now, when you think about, and we'll see this in a later chapter, when you think about poverty 50 years ago in the US in particular was a lot worse than poverty today, because we have higher standard of living based on technology and increased advances in technology, based on free trade, and also based on government programs, food stamps, welfare, those kinds of things that help people. So anyway, getting back to this, poverty, just let me say, poverty today in America is not what poverty used to be, because higher standards of living affect everybody, even those at the lowest levels. But anyway, getting back to this, so we've gone from half of the world population being in poverty 50 years ago to 15% being in poverty today. But this is what's so fascinating, I think, in this chapter is, if you think about back to in the mid 1700s, 90% of the world was living in poverty. Okay, that is earning less than $1 per day in today's dollars. Okay, by 1800 or by 1820, 80% of the world's earning less than $1 today in today's dollars. By 1900, 70%. So what changed all this? Industrial Revolution. So, I mean, you all know about the Industrial Revolution from school. It just caused this such an increase in cheap goods and services. It increased our productivity so much, 1,000-fold or more, and enabled us to have a much higher standard of living. So what did the Industrial Revolution basically increase GDP through technology, which continues today. And we continue, when we get to the GDP chapter, gross domestic product, you will see that technology is one of the main factors for increasing GDP and therefore increasing our standard of living. All right, so let's continue on with this. In 1906, a little more than 100 years ago, the average annual wage in today's dollars, mind you, is $4,000. So think about that. Think about if you were only earning $4,000 a year in today's dollars, earning $4,000 today. That's what people were earning back in 1906. So we're really lucky to be living as much as we complain and as many problems as we have. We are really lucky to be living in the time we're living in. People really struggled in the past and had, nothing near the wealth that we have today. And that's really a result of technology. Okay, so now let's look at the fifth, at number 5 here. So economic growth is much higher in capitalistic countries. Why is this? Because of economic incentives. In these communist countries, there's no incentive. So let me give you this example. I was reading this professor did this experiment, and he said, okay, you're all going to get the same grade in this class. So he gave the first exam, and before he said this, he gives the first exam. There's A's, B's, C's, D's, and F's. Second exam, he says, you're all going to get the same grade. We're going to do an experiment in Marxism, experiment in communism. You're all getting the same grade. So for the second exam, the first exam, you had pretty much the bell curve. Then the second exam, you had like a B average in the course overall. And the third exam, it goes down to like a C average. By the last exam for the course, the average is way down. So here's what happened. The people who studied really hard were thinking, well, why should I study so hard when everyone is everyone's getting, I'm not just studying for myself, everyone is taking advantage of my studying really hard to get the grade. And then other people said, well, I don't really need to study hard because other people are going to study hard. So I can just kind of piggyback onto them. So there was less and less studying going on as the course progressed, and the grades just got worse and worse. It was kind of a case of groupthink, if you will. So that's basically communism in a nutshell. People behave based on incentives. And if you don't have the incentives to better your position or better your life, then you're not going to be as productive. And so working for the collective, that's great in theory. Unfortunately, human nature takes over and it just doesn't work. And so that's why you see capitalist countries have a much higher standard of living than these communist countries. And also, the whole idea, the theory of Marxism, the theory of communism is great. It just doesn't work out because of human nature. And so the theory of Marxism, of course, is that you shouldn't have this economic disparity, that you should have, everyone should be equal. Well, everyone is not going to be equal because of human nature. People are not created equal. And even if, let's just say, for example, we all started out, let's say that the government gave us, let's say we had nothing and the government gave each of us $100,000, trying to make us all equal. Well, at the end of the year or at the end of a certain time, some of us are going to be wealthier than others because some people are going to invest the money, start a new business, invest the money, do very well through luck and ingenuity and timing. Other people will, do okay. Some people might go to the casino. Some people might use it on drugs and alcohol. So, everyone, even if you try to make people equal as far as have, the same amount of money, you're still going to have this disparity. It doesn't work. So anyway, if you, the argument that there's this equality, that you can have, you have equality in these communist countries and have less income disparity doesn't work out, because of the reason that because of the example that I just gave, but also because you can't get rid of human nature. You can't get rid of these incentives. And so actually studies have shown right here that there's no greater divergence between the rich and the poor in these capitalist versus these communist countries. And I would actually argue, if you think about Russia, you have a much lower standard of living because there's no economic incentives. So the vast majority of people don't have a lot of money. And then you have these Russian oligarchs through corruption who have all of this wealth. So we've been seeing, again, it's March 2022. We've got this, situation going on in the Ukraine, and we see these Russian oligarchs who have these multi-million-dollar yachts floating around, and it's basically they've gotten it through capitalism, and a lot of it is through by corruption, by basically stealing money. So it's not definitely, we've seen that communism has been a failure. Communism was like the great experiment of the 20th century. It's been a total failure. Okay, so anyway, getting back to this, economic growth is higher in capitalist countries because of economic incentives, and it's declining in communist countries. The average growth rate of gross domestic product is, so if we think about, so let me back up for a second before, we haven't gotten to the GDP chapter yet, but think about GDP as being a circular model. So everything that we produce, we consume. And so it's a circular model. So you produce, you make goods and services, produce goods and services, you get paid. So GDP equals your income. So if the GDP per person in a country, GDP per capita is $40,000, then the income per capita is $40,000. So GDP equals income. So as GDP rises, income rises. All right, so the average annual GDP growth rate in capitalist countries is 2.3%. So, and since GDP equals income, this means that our living standards are growing by 2.3% per year. So what does this mean? This means that our standard of living will double every 31 years. So, some years we have higher GDP. This is the average of capitalist countries. Ours is usually between 2 and 3%. When there's a recession, it goes negative. When we were coming out of COVID, it's been quite positive recently, pretty high. Anyway, so this is this really interesting little tricky formula called the rule of 72. The rule of 72 tells how long it takes, how many years to double. So if you take, and 72 is simply the numerator. So if you take 72 divided by 2.3, that equals 31.3. So that means that if GDP is growing or at 2.3% a year, then that country's standard of living will double every 31 years. So that's why we're so much wealthier than our parents, grandparents, and great-grandparents, because GDP has doubled every 31 years in this country, so more or less. All right, now you might be thinking, well, Dr. Lawrence is saying I should be wealthier than my parents, but I'm not really wealthier than my parents. I don't have more money. But it's not in terms of that. It's all of the stuff that you have. So if you think about the computers, the electronics, maybe your parents only had one car when you were a kid. You might have two cars. So it's just, it's not just the amount of money that you're making, because you might feel like you're struggling, but it's, it's getting a college education. It's all of the material possessions that you have. So anyway, back to this. They found that that capitalist countries, the GDP growth rate is 2.3%, and if you use the rule of 72, standards of living are doubling every 31 years. All right, now I want to take this. I'm going to regress for a minute back to chapter 1, because I forgot to mention this in the chapter 1 video. When you're reading about the common law versus civil law and so forth, they talk about economic growth and the civil law versus the common law countries. And they say they found that economic growth, or GDP, is 1/3 higher in common law countries versus civil law countries. Well, and they also found that that standards of living are 20% higher will be 20% higher over a 30-year period in these common law versus civil law. And over a century, that's an 80% difference in real income per capita. So make sure you'll see that in chapter 1 when you read it. And they also talk about Mexico versus the US. And they mentioned that, for example, the real income per capita, or income per person in Mexico, is 18,000. I think it's been updated to 20,000 this recent edition. But anyway, 18 to 20,000 for Mexico, 56 to 60,000 GDP income per capita per year in the US. So they hypothesized that if Mexico had developed the same political and legal institutions as the US, they would be equal. But Mexico doesn't have the same political institutions. They don't have the same legal institutions. They've got corruption, and they don't have a strong rule of law and secure property rights. That's why their income is so much lower than ours, because there hasn't been as much investment and so forth. Anyway, I just wanted to mention that in this chapter because it's relevant in this chapter, and I forgot in chapter 1. Okay, so getting back to this, capitalist versus communist countries, they found no greater divergence between the rich and the poor. secure property rights from chapter 1 and the rule of law, and the reliance on the markets to allocate scarce resources equals a higher standard of living at all income levels. So let's look at some examples. North versus South Korea. All right. North Korea per capita income, 1,800 per year. South Korea, 33,000 per year. So the Korea is a great test case, because after the Korean War, we basically just capitulated during the Korean War, and North Korea stayed communist. We couldn't beat the communists, and South Korea was capitalist. So that was the agreement there. So you can look at North Korea is really the last. It's an extreme case of a closed country, communist, very isolated, closed country, per capita income 1,800. South Korea, capitalist. They're producing. They're very hardworking, based on incentives. They're actually making some pretty decent cars. The Hyundai, it's kind of where Japan was in the 1960s with their cars. Japanese cars in the 60s and 70s, people just laughed. But look at where they are today. Honda, Toyota, Nissan, Lexus. They make very high quality cars. Same thing, South Korea is trying to get there too, and the Hyundai is actually a pretty good car. And the way it's a good quality, they give a really the warranty is very long, like 80 to $100,000 mile warranty on their cars. And I think they have an upscale Hyundai called the Genesis. They have an electric car that has been getting some awesome reviews. And so that's going to be real interesting to see how South Korea progresses with that. I think they're going to become, the South Korean cars, Hyundai cars, are going to be more and more popular. Anyway, and then also the Samsung is made in South Korea. So, and on a side note, let's say you wanted to invest in Samsung. You can't buy the stock, but you can buy a South Korean mutual fund or exchange traded fund, which gives you all these companies in South Korea that also invest in Samsung. So on a side note there, that's what some people will do if they want to invest in Apple, and they're invested in Apple, but they also want to invest in Samsung. Okay, anyway, it's really interesting at the end of the chapter when they talk about the North versus South Korea. Also West Berlin versus East Berlin. So the Berlin Wall fell in the, late 80s, early 90s. I think it might have been 1989. But anyway, there was a stark difference in standards of living between East and West Berlin. It's equaled somewhat now, but not still West Berlin has a much higher standard of living compared to East Berlin, because they were so far behind the 8 ball. And I read a really interesting article about why the Berlin Wall fell. Excuse me. CNN is the answer to that. So you might think, why is CNN the answer to the Berlin Wall falling? Well, what happened was, as you know, after World War II, East Berlin was communist and West Berlin was capitalist. And in East Berlin, they told the government was telling the residents of East Berlin while they were living in isolation all these years, how terrible things were in the West, how decadent things were, and just how awful it was. And then when CNN started having the 24-hour, CNN started the first 24-hour news service, and people started getting more information and getting cable. And so somehow or another, these people in East Berlin were able to start watching CNN. And when they were able to see CNN, they realized, well, wait a second, things are actually pretty good out there. They're not terrible. And the government's been lying to us. And there was just this this overwhelming mentality just to knock the Berlin Wall down. And it's kind of interesting it's kind of fascinating to read or to watch some news clips about that time, because it's like all of a sudden one day the Berlin Wall just came down. So anyway, and that was the part of it. That was a part of it. So so that brings us back to what's going on today, March 2020, with we've got this war going on with Russia's aggression against the Ukrainians, and this is the first war that we've had. A war that's really being covered. Of course, we've had other conflicts, but it's the first war that we've had where they've really, you've got all this, you've got social media, everyone's got a camera. It's going to be interesting to see the differences of how technology changes the coverage of these wars and conflicts going forward. Okay, because the Russians are telling people that they're trying to use their propaganda on their propaganda news channel, telling one story that's totally incorrect, and they've tried to the Russians have tried to shut down social media and stuff, but I think things are still getting through. So it's going to be really interesting to see how this all unfolds. Okay, anyway, that's it for this chapter. So interesting chapter to give you a perspective on poverty, capitalism, and growth. And don't be depressed about the era that we're living in, because in any era that you live in, there's always good and bad. There's always good things and there's always bad things, but we do have a lot to be thankful for. And I try to look at the glass as half full. So anyway, that's chapter 4. Take care.